This drawing is called Despair, and I'm going to take you through how I drew it. Now, for most of my drawings, when people ask, what medium did you use? I tell them graphite and charcoal. But for this drawing, the answer is a little different. It is only charcoal. Well, maybe with a tiny smidge of graphite. You see, I've come to realize that to achieve peak hyperrealism, you need to embrace the dark. You need to embrace charcoal. And we'll talk more about embracing the dark later. But for now, I want you to ready yourself for an extensive use of charcoal in this drawing. But there's no need to be afraid because I'll take you through how I used the charcoal and the exact methods I used to make it realistic. So I started by drawing the bare minimum of outlines and I began shading the eyes, or should I say shading the semblance of the eyes, because these are highlights, and even though I don't think I've drawn close eyelids before, these shouldn't be too hard to draw. I mean, it's basically just skin. Now, if you're finding it hard to shade, let me tell you the formula I use when I shade. Shadows first, then highlights. Now for these closed highlights, I don't need to ask myself, where are the shadows, the darkest darks, and where are the highlights, the brightest brights? Now in this area, it's pretty easy to spot. This part is the highlights and these ends here are the shadows. As you can see, I'm using my graphite pencil to shade. Well, I'm not really using it to shade as much as I'm using it to mark the areas that are dark and the areas where the highlights will be. Normally, I would go in with a few layers of graphite shading, but we are not wasting time with graphite here. We are going straight with our charcoal powder. If you'd like to find out how to make charcoal powder, you can check out this video for a guide on how to make homemade charcoal powder. As you can see, this left part of the eyelid is basically complete blackness, so I'm going to use my charcoal pencil to shade that area. Take note that I am only using a charcoal pencil to shade the dark areas. For any gray areas or for any blending, I'll be using my makeup brush. Now that the skin of the eyelid has been shaded, I can now add the details on top. There are many ways that you can draw skin details, but for this I'll be using my 2B pencil to draw lines and dots and different type of shapes. In terms of skin details, it's basically the Wild West here. Well, until I find a better technique at least. What I'm basically doing is looking at the reference well to see the kind of shapes and lines that I will draw. But to depict the roundness of the eyelid, I'll be using more curved lines to show that shape. After that, I'll use my eraser to make the highlights for the details. I find myself switching between the kneaded eraser and the Tombow Mono Zero eraser for highlight details. And then for the other eyelid, I use the same method. But for now, let's move to the nose. When I first saw this nose, I understood how people feel whenever they see challenging references. You know, how do I even start? But there's no need to be confused. Do you remember the formula we mentioned at the beginning? Shadows first, then highlights. So we first block out the shadows. Now for the nose, there is a very visible shadow, the cast shadow on the left part of the nose. So I use my 2B pencil to block that part out. Like I said, we will not be using graphite much in this drawing. So after I use my graphite pencil to apportion where the shadows are, I blend and I go right away with my charcoal powder. I'll be making a detailed guide very soon on how to actually shade with charcoal from scratch, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on that. But for now, what I am doing is basically just using a small makeup brush to touch on the very dark areas. This small brush is very helpful because if there is something that we know about charcoal, it's that it doesn't like to be controlled. Once you put charcoal powder on your paper, it goes everywhere. But this small brush gives me a measure of control. Like a pencil, I'm able to zero in and precisely shade the areas that I want to be darker. And then to blend things better and smoother, I use a slightly bigger brush. But the shadows are still not dark enough. Let's fix that by dropping the powder for a while and going all in with the charcoal pencil. I use the charcoal pencil to fill the dark areas, and I also use my brush to blend out the sharp edges and fill out the rest of the nose. Of course, this nose won't be finished without some good old highlights, so I use my Tombow Mono Zero eraser to erase the highlights so it can shine more. Then I use my electric eraser to create some dots around the highlights for some details. For the cheek, something you'll notice is that this top part of the right cheek is lighter than the bottom part, and this is because the light is coming from the top, so the area around the jaw is somewhat hidden from the light, so it will be darker. As a result of this, after I give the right cheek just one layer of shading with graphite, I touch it with a little powder, and then I direct all my resources to the jaw and chin just to make it darker. I also add more shading with charcoal powder. As you can see, we have some details here in the chin, but the goal is to shade and darken this jaw as much as possible before we draw the details, because if we draw the details too early and then we realize that we need to add more shading, this will now mean that we have to add shading on top of the details, which will mess things up. But back to the cheeks, like I've always done for the left cheek also, I begin by shading the darkest part, the shadows, and then from there I fill out the rest of the cheek. But you might be wondering, why am I avoiding this left part of the face like the plague? Well, the reason should be obvious by now. It is because all that is there is just plain jet black. If I shade that now, all that dark charcoal will smear all over and smudge the other detailed parts. So I'm keeping it for much later in the drawing process. And since it is just simple black shading, it is better to focus on the more complex shading and the details in other areas. If you want a more detailed explanation of my shading process, as usual, you can always find the real-time version of this drawing over on Patreon at patreon.com/JasonLegendaryArt. You can also find the link in the description. I covered the shading of this forehead in the last video, so let's move on to the hair. I'm not going to lie, when I first saw the hair, I was like, damn, yep, I finally met my match. But let me show you what I did. I divided the hair into 3 sections: the base of the hair, the left bun, and the right bun. Now for the base of the hair, what do you see in the reference? Black. Yeah, it's hard to see because it is very dark, but from what I can make out, it is like curly afro type of hair. So I doubled down and went with that. From my experience, when it comes to shading afro hair, all it needs are circles upon circles. So I started. Of course, I did it layer by layer, making the circles smaller and tighter with each layer. And of course, we cannot forget the edges. The black ladies in the house will know what I'm talking about. I started by shading the skin underneath the hair, and then I used a mixture of short, long, thin and thick lines to draw the edges. For the left part of the bun, I noticed a slight shine in the hair, so I also doubled down again and tried to get that shine in the hair. I also noticed the same shine on the right part of the bun. I covered how to get hair shine in this video here, so you can check that out. But basically, I carried on with shading the neck, the shoulders, and this is where I'll start to tell stories that touch the heart. You see, my SD card got corrupted, so the entire process of me filming, drawing the background got wiped completely. And it's a bummer because there was something about this drawing of the background that I wanted to show you. But don't worry, I'll be making a dedicated video on drawing backgrounds, and I will tell you all you need to know, so make sure you stick around for that. But that's not all you should stick around for, because as you guys already know, the drawing is over. The details have been done. Our work is complete. So it's time for the reveal.